Good morning, everybody. So today we're going to talk about libp2p connections. So if you've been working on libp2p for a while, you're probably very familiar with the connections, and it's not a problem, and grasping everything is fine. But for people who are onboarding, the concepts that are going on in connections can be a little daunting and complicated. So we're going to try to make that easier to understand today. So what's the idea behind what we're trying to do with libp2p? A big challenge of distributed internet is how we can reliably and easily connect to peers all over the world and maybe eventually a satellite in space. So connecting two things who are capable of talking to each other is a relatively simple task. The problem is when it's not easy to talk to one another. What happens when we have millions of nodes? What happens when things don't speak the same language or the same version of the same language? So, and what happens when things are locked down behind firewalls or inside of containers? So the problem gets complicated quickly. Talking to each other is no longer trivial. So what we're trying to do with libp2p is make all of that as simple as possible so that more people can help us grow the distributed internet. So how does this all work? There are a lot of concepts that go into making this easy, such as peer discovery, content routing, NAT traversal, more and more. But today we're going to focus on the actual connection itself. So in order to kind of understand the flow of things, we're going to break it down into its components. So we've exploded the libp2p logo here into its components. So we can talk about transports, circuit relays, protocol muxing, stream muxing, privatization, and encryption, and we're going to try to make it all make sense. So transports. In order for libp2p to be extensible, which is really important in making sure that we can maintain and grow libp2p, we need to be able to change how things are able to talk to one another. So transports let us do that. So ultimately what we're trying to do is we use the transports to expose our actual dial and listen interfaces. These are the things that enable us to actually talk to one another. So they're going to make the calls, they're going to answer the phones, metaphorically speaking. So a given libp2p node can have any number of transports it needs in order to communicate. So we might see transports like TCP, WebSockets, WebRTC, UDP, QUIC, and more. So circuit relays. Communicating from isolation is a problem. It's a problem in the browser. Being able to dial to other nodes isn't such a problem, but other things being able to talk to the browser is kind of a pain. And so we need to make that easier to do. What circuit relays give us is the ability to kind of route our calls through central servers or just servers in general so that we can make sure that we can talk to one another. This is also super valuable in isolated networks. If we create a private container, right, that we have multiple nodes speaking in, and we want to lock down which nodes are actually able to talk to the public, we can use circuit relays to do that. So protocol muxing. We talked about libp2p needing to be flexible. We want to create and need to create connections that can evolve as technology evolves. So we don't end up in a situation in 10 years where all this is antiquated and it doesn't work and now we have to use something else. What we're trying to do with libp2p is make sure that we can make those connections flexible, that we can grow them, we can improve the technology so libp2p works indefinitely. So muxers, encryption, other components, they're all going to change over time. They need to change, we want them to change. So we need to make sure that it's as easy as possible to plug and play that. So let's talk about what they are. So protocol muxing. So in protocol muxing, we have multi-streams. So they're self-describing formats. So they enable us to prepend data with protocol paths, which represent the data that we're actually sending. So this allows protocol muxers to take incoming data at the protocol and understand how to resolve that. So it gives us the flexibility to communicate with different data types. We don't need to restrict ourselves to single formats. because the data is self-describing. It will tell you how to resolve it. It's kind of like it's packaged up and labeled, and you read the label to understand what to do with it. So multiplexing, which is often referred to as muxing. So if you see that and you're like, what's a muxer? It's multiplexing, and we're going to talk about that. So if you're not familiar with what multiplexing is, it's a concept that traces back to the early days of telegraphs and telephones. So this is like the late 1800s, I think. So the concept behind it allows, if you think about a telephone line, it's the concept that lets multiple calls go through a single line all at the same time. Without it, telephones would be really impossible to work with, or we'd have wires everywhere. So the idea with this in telephone networks is frequency-based. So I make a call, you make a call, those go through at different frequencies so that they don't clash, so that when we send it to a switch, we're able to route it to the right place. And this is kind of how this is going to work, and we're going to talk about how that specifically works with libp2p, but you can kind of think of that in terms of this, of we're routing based on frequency, conversation A is on a frequency, conversation B is on a frequency. It's all going through the same line, the same connection, but we're able to route it to the right place because it has a unique identifier. So with networks, it's often important to lock things down. We don't always want to talk to everybody, even though it's peer-to-peer. Sometimes we need to restrict who we're talking to. So protectors and privatization is a way for us to do that. So ultimately what we're trying to do is prevent unwanted connections by leaking as little data as humanly possible so that we can close connections as quickly as possible so we're not talking to strangers. So protectors allow us to protect connections to get privatization. And we'll talk about how that works in a little bit. Encryption and privatization, not the same thing. Encryption happens for privatization, but there's a lot more going on inside of encryption, including identification. So what libp2p does is it gives us the ability to have any number of encryptors we need. Just as we talked about connection flexibility, we want our encryption to also be flexible going forward. Right now, libp2p is using sec.io, but what happens when we finally get TLS 1.3 support in Node or Go or anything else? We want to be able to upgrade that over time, right? But we also want to be able to support some of these legacy systems so that we can roll this out so that we don't just like kill off versions of the network that are only using sec.io. So we talked about concepts. So let's actually get into the flow and see how this works. And I'm going to kind of describe it, and then we'll do some visualizations to hopefully help with that. So the first step is actually establishing the connection, right? We need to dial so that somebody can pick up the phone. And we do this with multi-addresses. You'll regularly see it referred to as multi-adder because we hate E's and S's. So when we're ready to connect to somebody, we send our multi-address to the switch, or the swarm, so that it can make the dial request out to the node we want to talk to. So here's an example of some multi-adders, and I've updated it to IP6, so Kyle's happy. So right here we can see three concepts, and the last one is really big and nasty and dirty, but we're going to break it down so that you can kind of see what's going on there. At the top, we see that we are dialing over TCP to IP6. One of the really incredibly useful things about multi-addresses is not only where we're going to talk to something, it's how we're going to talk to something. So imagine you have someone you want to talk to, and they have a universal address. So like phone, post, email, it doesn't matter, it's all the same actual address. So if that person is missing a mailbox or a phone or a computer, you're going to send a communication and it's not going to get there. So what this allows us to do is not only specify where we're talking to, but how we're going to talk to them, what medium we're going to talk to them over. Oh, I was going to tell you a little bit more about that nasty one at the bottom. So circuit relays are super nice. What they allow us to do is not only talk to the eventual person that we want to talk to, but we can see the path of how that goes through, which is super helpful because the person that we end up picking up the call, they actually know how we got there. So they can dial back to us, which is super useful. So splitting this circuit relay, we see our P2P circuit, which is the identifier that we are going over a circuit relay. We can then see that in this instance, we're going over IPv4, where we're calling to, we're calling over WebSockets via TCP, and then we're going to an IPFS node. Once we get there, we're going over another circuit relay to another IPFS node. So now that we've opened up our connection, we need to start negotiating protocols. We talked about flexibility in connections. And so what we need to do is talk about, negotiate how the kind of the language that we're going to talk. And so this is what's happening with protocol negotiation. So we start a conversation with the exchange of protocols, connect to our nodes. If this doesn't work, right? If we go through and I'm going to send multi-stream 100 and somebody else is like, no, I don't support that, we just stop talking. Like, I don't need to talk to you anymore. We're not speaking the same language. We don't mux the same way. We're just going to stop talking. So this allows us to establish that initial form of communication. So on success of this, we start with all of our sub-protocol negotiation, which we'll talk a little bit about. So once we've finished protocol negotiation, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start dealing with routing our protocols to their handlers or our muxers. So in this example, what we kind of have is talking about flexibility. We've got Bob and Alice are talking to each other. The first thing that happens is Bob sends over his protocol. It says, okay, I speak multi-stream 100. Alice responds back with, yes, I also speak multi-stream 100. And then Alice immediately says, also, let's talk over SecIO 100 because encryption. Bob is like, nope, I've upgraded. I only speak TLS 1.3. So he just goes and says that's not available. Try again. So Alice comes back and says, okay, I've upgraded. I also support TLS 1.3, but because I, Alice, am a nice human being, I'm still supporting SecIO until we deprecate that. So Alice comes back and says, okay, TLS 1.3. Bob says, yes, TLS 1.3, and then encryption happens. All of our data is secure now. So super helpful. Important parts of messages, we can kind of split it up into headers and the actual data that we're sending. So anytime a new stream is created, we give it a given ID. So going back to our idea of frequencies, these streams get unique identifiers so we know where to route it to so that we don't start convoluting all of these conversations. So in the header, what we're able to do is we encode a flag in the header that tells us what we want to do with the connection. We're establishing a connection, what's going on there. And then we also include the ID. So it's an action and our identifier. In the data snippet, a super important part of that is in the data snippet at the very beginning of it, we tell you how long the data is going to be. So we give its length and we stick it at the front. So what we're able to do as a receiver on the other line of that, we read the first bit and say, okay, how long is this information? Oh, it's 20 bytes. Sweet. Oh no. Talking too long. So we read that first bit of it and says, okay, this is 20 bytes long. I'm going to read 20 bytes. Why this is important is because we might have a lot of messages queued up in that, right? There might be a megabyte of data or a kilobyte of data, but we only want 20 bytes. If we don't know what that is, we're not going to know when to stop reading, which actually gets really interesting in privatization when all of that's encrypted, because you go to try to read how long something's going to be. It's like, oh, actually, it's 1,000 bytes. But in reality, it's only 20 bytes, and you read the wrong thing, and bad things happen. But it's super great, because then we're not talking to each other when we don't need to. So encryption. We talked a bit about SecIO yesterday, but we crammed it into a very brief poster in a minute. But we're not going to dive deep into those concepts today because that's a whole nother topic. But once we finish muxing, we go through encryption. So, and what that is going to entail is going to be a full handshake of, okay, now that we're going to talk encryption, we've decided we're going to talk TLS 1.3 or SecIO, we need to have a conversation about how that's actually going to work. So we start exchanging ciphers, things like that, to have a conversation so that we can share, negotiate, verify, and then start exchanges. So every message sent between the nodes is encrypted and decrypted respectively. If there are any encryption failures, if verification fails, we stop. We stop talking. Like, this isn't going to work out. I don't trust you. You don't trust me. Let's just stop talking. So we just talked about a lot of concepts. So it would probably help to maybe look at some pictures that hopefully are pretty. So this is the first thing that we're doing, right? We're talking from one computer to the other computer, one device to another device, and we're going to do that over some medium. Let's say it's TCP. So now we're going to introduce SecIO, right? So we're talking over TCP, and we have our SecIO muxers here. So everything in between them is encrypted. Everything on the inside of our computer is plain text, so we can read and figure out what other muxers we need to deal with to unwrap that communication. So, and this is what we see there, right? Of SecIO takes it, pulls in the stream, translates it into plain text, and then passes it off to another muxer to do something with. So circuit relays are interesting, but it's the same principle. We're talking with one computer, and we establish a connection with them. And then it talks with the thing that we want to talk with and establishes a connection. And then we create a virtual connection to send all of its data through so that everybody knows where this traffic is going, but the person in the middle doesn't know what data we're actually sending, right? Because we've negotiated that with the person on the other side. We just know how we're getting there. So if that didn't help, I thought of another thing this morning. If you're familiar with nesting dolls, this is kind of this concept that we're dealing with. Each thing that we go through, whether it's SecIO, any additional muxers, it's a piece of this nesting doll that also comes with a handy label that tells us what to do with it. So this is kind of like our headers and our protocols. We can go and say, okay, I've got this thing, it's SecIO, it's got a label, let me read the label. Okay, I know how to open that. So we can open that encryption box and pull out the next box, and we read its label, see out where it's going to go, and then we hand it on and on and on and on until we have the actual data that we want to do. So privatization is like another thing. It's the bigger nesting doll that we're jamming all of that information into that nesting doll, and we're encrypting it so that we can privatize this whole connection, one extra layer of security. With that, right, we get our restriction of the network, we exchange a 24-byte nonce, and then everything's encrypted, right? So we talked, I think, did a demo of private networking earlier this week, and you can see that everything is encrypted, right? The 24-byte nonce goes through, and all of it looks like encrypted data because it's just bytes. We're just exchanging bytes that don't make any sense. So this is kind of what this looks like, and I made them different so it's a little bit easier to see, but basically it's just going to come back as this byte stream. So we've got a 24-byte nonce here, and then that Alice sends, and then Alice sends the next step of that, which in this instance is actually going to be our multi-stream protocol. Bob's going to respond back with his byte nonce, and then his multi-stream protocol. So, and then all packages is just encrypted data. So hopefully that will help make that concept a little bit easier to understand. So at this point, right, we have our nesting dolls, everything's pulled out, now we can just share information freely. We can share information encrypted, send that across to our peers. Yay! So We're going to continue to update this and provide these docs and put them places where people can look at it. So here's some additional documentation. We want to continue to improve that, continue to make that better. So if you know of where documentation is, let me know. Let's help with that. And if you have concepts, like, or better ways to describe these concepts, please come talk to me. Because I would love to help share that out and we want to continue to grow libp2p. And a critical part of that is making this really easy to digest so that people can help build onto this and make it more consumable for more and more people so that we can grow the libp2p community. And that's it. Thank you. Does anybody have questions?
I suppose more of a comment. I was thinking about this at the more abstracted layer for how we do handshake. And I think now actually at the networking layer, it makes more sense to just use all the inherent network layer for authentication. So I'm trying to do basically authentication like TLS over the P2P. And so I think I was trying to abstract this at the higher level, but does it make sense now actually at the networking layer is just let SecIO and TLS do the handshaking. My question is for circuit relaying, in order to create the nonce, and then go through the circuit relay, you actually have to exchange a nonce with the, like Bob is, let's say Charlie is a circuit relay. You need to get Bob and exchange a nonce with Bob first before you actually then can go through the circuit relay. So how does Charlie actually, without being a man-in-the-middle attack?
So the important thing the thing in the middle, right, Charlie, let's say, is if man-in-the-middle attacks they're hard to do with encryption or with kind of that network privatization, because if we exchange our nonce and we actually establish this network, right, and then we establish this network, what happens if man-in-the-middle attack goes there? All of that data is encrypted and can't be read, or it can be read, but it's encrypted garbage. Like understanding, we talked about kind of the headers of where to read. Like one of the things that actually happens in a private network, if you go to read that data, you can't figure out how much to actually read in the byte stream. So you go to read the prefix length, and normally it might be 20 bytes, but that data is encrypted, and so it ends up telling you, oh, this is 5 bytes, or this is 1,000 bytes, or this is 20 kilobytes. And you're either going to not read enough, and it's going to fail, or you're going to start reading, and eventually the stream might stop because there's not actually 20 kilobytes of data coming through.
I think it's worth mentioning that the connection from the source to the target is end-to-end encrypted between the source and the target. So the intermediary is not actually just passing data for them. He's passing, just passing the stream, and then they encrypt over that stream that is passed. So the guy in the middle has no access to anything.
But you still have to actually get to the shared secret for Bob. If Bob's not dialable, how do you actually do that big priority?
You have his you have the hash of his public key. So with that, you can bootstrap a secure connection.
Okay. That's the pyramid. Okay, yeah. All right.
Other questions? Okay, great. All right, well, thank you, Jacob.